also want to give a particular welcome to our colleagues and our students joining us from Morocco, from other parts, because I think it's really important to talk about the local as well as the global implications of some of the key political social movements that we're talking about. So obviously the women-led protests in Iran are taking place in the context of the Middle East. So it's really beneficial for us to be able to talk about some of the regional implications that this could be having there. So question one, how did we get here? Just a very brief talk of Iran. So Iran does have geographical significance. It is a pretty large country land-wise. It's also one of the most populous countries in the Middle East with roughly about 83 million population. Majority of the population would be my generation. So I'm part of that baby boomer generation. And it was never formally colonized, but it did come under intense foreign influence, particularly by Britain, particularly by Soviet Union, and then until 1979 by United States. And we can imagine why it was such a hot spot for these foreign influences. Obviously, geographically, it's in the center. It's connecting Asia and Europe in some ways. It's also oil rich, and obviously it's really pivotal for us to be stable so that the region as a whole can stay stable. It has had a number of major political social developments within the past decades, number of popular revolutions, such as the Constitutional Revolution of 1906, but perhaps one of the most significant ones would be the 1979 Popular Revolution, that toppled a secular monarchy and instead of it brought about a theocracy. A theocracy means it's a type of government that merges religion with politics. So those are both put together. The name of the country became Islamic Republic of Iran, and you'll be able to see between sort of the flags. This was the pre-1979 flag, which was known as the Persian lion and sun flag. And then it was replaced by the current flag, which is the flag of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has the words Allah in Arabic in the center of it, and then the writings of Allahu Akbar, or God is greater. So very much religious undertones, very clearly. Continuing on, question number one, women did play key roles in toppling the Pahlavi monarchy that was in power from 1925 until 1979. This was a popular revolution, so people across genders, ethnicities, religious ideologies were participating in it. We had Marxist feminist groups very much involved in the revolution. We had religious groups, Islamic groups, leftist religious groups, and the big reason for women as well participating in this popular revolution was because of large sections of the society were dissatisfied with the monarchy. Many considered it to be corrupt. Many considered it to be an arm of the United States. There was extensive secularization and westernization policies that were not popular with large sections of the society, including many women. Obviously, many were supportive of the Pahlavi regime, but many others were not. However, after the establishment of the 1979, so the revolution was a popular revolution. It really just focused on toppling the Pahlavi monarchy. Following it is when the founders of the Islamic Republic of Iran, they emphasized the conservative gender ideology. And that conservative gender ideology was particularly put forward by a conservative cleric at the time, the founder called Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And if I want to define what I mean by a conservative gender ideology, I mean one that really sees women's primary duties to be within the domestic sphere. So very much emphasizes women as mothers, as wives, and you actually had policies that were passed very soon after the establishment of the theocracy. For instance, one of those policies was banning female judgeship. So within just weeks of the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran, a number of female, actually all of them, were just released from their work because you could no longer serve as a judge, as a woman. There was also talk of mandatory veiling. That faced a lot of resistance. Policies of gender segregation, all of these faced a lot of resistance, and as well as very limited family rights that were put in place. by 1982, so not by 1979, by 1982 is when unveiled women entering the public sphere could get punished, and the punishment was lashes. So it took about 3 years before mandatory veiling became the law of the land, but it is the law. But women never remained silent to these very conservative, extremist policies. So the first anti-theocracy protest actually took place on International Women's Day on March 8, 1979. And that was in response to women just panicking at that stage. Women were saying, oh, wow, we just toppled the monarchy. We did not sign up for a conservative gender ideology. And yet there's talk of mandatory veiling, there's talk of conservative gender thought. So they actually poured into the streets, as you see in that image. There's documentaries on this. There's actually footage of this protest taking place where women are truly panicking about it. However, they did not receive the support of the men at that time. So a lot of those who were really high on that revolutionary fever just basically told women, well, just be patient. Just be patient until we get freedom, we become more independent from West's influence, and then we'll attend to your rights, to your issues. So that was perhaps the first time. Throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, there were extensive campaigns to go ahead and reform discriminatory laws on women's rights. A lot of these campaigns ended up becoming successful. For instance, in the early 2000s, there was a campaign to collect 1 million signatures to change discriminatory laws on family law in Iran, which was actually modeled after the Moroccan 1 million signatures campaign. So you will see that transnational link happening as well. We also had the 2009 Green Movement protest taking place, which was another women-led protest that was for democracy, for free and fair elections, and so on. And then the 2017, another instance was the Daughters of the Revolution Street protest, which is when women just peacefully would take off their headscarves and just stand at a public corner and just wave it on a stake. And that was their protest to mandatory veiling. A lot of them young women. The response of the state was harassment, arrest of these peaceful aspects of protest. So the current protests we can consider them as sort of the latest episode of a long history of sort of protests that are happening in Iran, particularly the gendered aspects of it. So the spark happened because of the killing of the 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian Mahsa Jina Amini in September 2022 over her attire. So she was visiting Tehran from her Kurdish province with her younger brother. She comes out of the metro station, and the morality police, which is the police that is the main task of it is to make sure that men and women are dressed in proper Islamic attire according to their conservative interpretations. She was arrested, and there's reports that she was brutally beaten, and she enters into a coma, and within 3 days later she dies. So that's why it's referred to her that she was killed. There was a lot of outrage about Mahsa's killing, not only domestically, but also very quickly internationally. And I think there's a very big intentional reason for that. The journalist, a female journalist who saw what happened to Mahsa, actually followed her, went to the hospital, found out that she was under a coma, took a picture of her basically vegetative state in the hospital. And she had two options. Her first option was to send this picture to her own local paper in Tehran. And her second option was to send it out internationally to international media. So she opted for the second option, and she actually sent the image out. And that's where it very quickly became a sort of global international outrage about it. Currently, that female journalist, Niloufar Hamidi, is in prison because of doing this, because of very boldly recognizing. And the outrage really became, and that's why the slogan and the mantra really became Women, Life, Freedom, because it was very clear that over a specific attire, you can face police brutality, and then over this actually lose your life, right? So it became a very fundamental aspect of it. It also was one of the first times that we've seen the movement and the protests become quite intersectional. What I mean by intersectional is that while it was women-led, very quickly different sections of the society joined forces. Men joined forces, the elderly, across ethnicity, across religious ideology, across the urban-rural divide. And this was one of those major successes of the movement. So remember when I said in March 8, 1979, when the Iranian women protested anti-veil, they did not face the support of the men. This was different. This is the time when the men actually realized, and many other sections of the society realized, that this is what the women are fighting for is very much part and parcel of my demands of freedom, equality, rule of law, anti-discrimination, and so on and so forth. And very quickly, the protest became anti-regime. And I think that's another thing to keep in mind, where it was very clear that they had said, we want substantive structural change, that the theocratic regime in its 43 years, now we're actually just celebrating the 44th year anniversary of the Islamic Republic of Iran, has not been able to give us what those fundamental rights and freedoms that people deserve. Yet the movement is leaderless, or these protests are leaderless. That means we are not seeing any specific person, political party, or group take the leadership of it. And I think that's another significance of it. There are different types of protests. There's street protests. There have not been very big numbers of people in the streets, and that's quite intentional. I'll be more than happy to talk about that. But in the context of Iran, it would not be helpful to have millions or hundreds of thousands into the streets, though on occasion we have had that. There's been a lot of social media campaigns. There's been civil disobedience, like strikes at oil refineries, at academic institutions. These have been really important political moves. Sit-ins, or even appearing unveiled in the public, which is something that women increasingly are doing. Political art, like songs, like Shaheen Hajipur's song, the graffiti cartoons, as well as protests and activism by Iranians abroad. This is another significant difference that we've seen with this round of elections, is that it's the first time that really Iranians outside have really rallied around this. And I think that's also a good question to ask of why in this case. I'm sure some of you might have already seen some of these images. They went viral thanks to social media, right? So for instance, burning the veil in a bonfire, right? When I was growing up in Iran, I would never imagine that could happen. But but when I saw that image, I was like, wow, this is some drastic things. Or giving the bird in pictures to the leaders of the Islamic Republic. And of course, funerals become sites of additional sort of protest and solidarity among different sections of society. So what the protests are not. I think we talked a lot about what the protests are. I think it's also important to talk about what the protests are not about. The protests are not anti-Islam, but rather they are pro-freedom. So the reason why we can say this is because we have many individuals, veiled women, religious groups, who are saying, we don't want to see mandatory veiling, right? And I think that's very critical to keep in mind. Obviously, my research, which is on women's political representation, and I specifically talk to women parliamentarians or elite women within the system, both in Iran and in Turkey. In the Iranian context, I often heard this in my interviews from veiled parliamentarians, that they would tell me, it looks bad on us if you have a morality police going around and harassing women over their headscarf, because then it reflects as though what I'm wearing is not based on my faith. What I'm wearing is not based on my religion. It's something someone forced me to do. So that debate has been quite ongoing. In fact, in 2018, the Iranian parliament launched an independent study on its own on whether we should have mandatory veiling in Iran or not. And majority of those that the research responded to said that there should not be mandatory veiling. It should be customary veiling. So this is all very much also internally within the Islamic Republic of Iran. The other thing that these protests are not is that they're not influenced by the West. The Islamic Republic of Iran, which is an excuse that it has every time some protests happen, it highlights and says, oh, these are just orchestrated by the West. These are just individuals who, these are not true Iranian girls and daughters, protesting, or youth. Whereas that is not the case. This episode of protest is just the latest of a long history of women's protests. and that it's distinctly anti-conservative gender ideology of Iran. Like specifically the demands that they're asking for within the context of Iran. Obviously, could they get inspiration transnationally? Yes, that's definitely true. But in the sense of the West actually orchestrating them, that is not true. So why do they matter? Do they matter? I would like to argue that they do matter. They matter because they are a liberatory moment/movement. Obviously, we have not categorized whether it's a movement, whether it's a moment, but nonetheless, it's something that deserves our attention. It's like any other liberatory movement that is asking for gender equality, that is asking for freedom, that is asking for anti-discrimination. Think about other liberatory movements that we've seen succeed, thankfully, in human history, like the anti-apartheid movement of South Africa, like the Black civil rights movement in the United States, or that is still ongoing. So I think this is yet another example of a movement that is grassroots driven, that is basing its demands based on its particular context, and it's asking for very major structural changes. So in that regard, it does deserve our attention, because liberation anywhere is liberation everywhere, right? So obviously we're all connected in that regard. And also, thanks to its intersectionality, it actually has the potential to lead to important structural changes inside of Iran. And I say this just because of the fact that for the first time, one of the first times in modern Iranian history, we're seeing individuals across ethnicity joining forces with one another, right? So the majority Persians are joining forces with the minority Kurds, with the minority Baluch, with the minority Arabs, and they're actually discussing and having a dialogue with one another. This is incredibly significant and important. And the reason for that is because the historically marginalized sections of the society are the ones who are pushing for these changes, right? So every time we have those individuals that truly have experienced discrimination and disenfranchisement, if you have them be at the forefront, then you can trust that whatever they come up with, whatever structural changes they come up with, will benefit everyone else, including the majority groups, right? So I think in that regard, it's actually really significant that you see these historically marginalized groups now having a discussion. My hope is, and my worry at the same time, is that this continues and that you don't have the dominant ethnic group sort of then eventually dominating, or the dominant gender, dominating the discussions, and actually seeing this happen throughout. But at the same time, these protests have definitely made the Islamic Republic of Iran feel threatened. And I think that's another reason why we need to pay attention, because it's going to the extent where the regime is cracking down so violently, and therefore we need to pay more attention to this. We've had protesters killed as part of the demonstrations, 527 thus far, 71 children killed. These are individuals under the age of 18. Protesters executed have been 4 thus far. Protesters with death sentences is 111. Individuals arrested is 19,600. And these are stats according as of today, because there's an actual source that tracks these on a daily basis, which another reason of how it's global. From 200,000 individuals that were surveyed, and I'll talk about the survey in just a little bit, mostly inside of Iran, about 81% said that they would not vote in support of the theocratic regime if a referendum was held today. So that's another reason of why we see the regime cracking down in such a violent way, is because they see that this is very much pushing back against their decades-long power. And it could also have regional implications for equality, democracy, peace, and stability. Obviously, Iran is neighbors with Afghanistan, where Taliban is in power. There's Turkey, there's Iraq. So a lot of countries where gender and women's rights issues have been a hot topic for a long time. So obviously, seeing a liberatory movement get somewhere in one country, in one context, it could have very important regional implications. This is the scientific survey that was launched in December of 2022, so just last month, by the Dutch Gammon Research Group. They surveyed more than 200,000 individuals. 158,000 of those were inside of Iran, and 43,000 of those were living outside of Iran. And this is the results where obviously not 100%, right? So because no population is homogeneous, but a good 81% from those surveys said that they would not vote for the theocracy, and 15.3%, yes, that said that they would vote for the theocratic regime. So the last reason of why I think they matter is that maybe we can learn from them as well, right? I think that's another thing that, especially if you want to be truly feminist, intersectional scholars or scholars in training, we need to really have an open mind to see what does it mean to have a movement that is specifically trying to challenge a conservative gender ideology that is specifically about bodily autonomy, right? About freedom of expression. And I think ever since the protests have taken place in Iran, I've had a pretty easy time teaching my students about it, because at the end of the day, it does come down to the issue of bodily autonomy. And we know how a conservative gender ideology can come and dictate what you can and you cannot do, with very little input from the people themselves, right? And you see how systematic it is, and you see how institutional and structural it is, and yet obviously you resisted against it. The other thing we can learn about it is that intersectional solidarity of it. As I said, I'm extremely hopeful and happy that it is intersectional. And that is something for us to take notes on. How do people across different groups are now in dialogue with one another, like ethnic groups, right? The Persians, who are the majority in Iran, as well as the Kurds, are now in conversation with one another. That is pretty major. And also learning about the strengths and weaknesses of the international human rights community. UN Women, where just last month, eventually because of extensive pressure, kicked Iran out of the Commission of Status of Women, where Iran was a member, right? So these are moments where we get to learn about, what are the double standards of the international community. The European Parliament is an entity that, the European Union in particular, that does trade with Iran. So that's where there's a lot of pressure. It's like, does money speak louder or human rights? And how are you going to go about this? And of course, the larger feminist movement, how they should respond to a lot of these. Okay, so I'm going to end with the last question, which is, how are we to show solidarity and support to the protest? The first thing that you guys all can do is to follow the news and to stay aware of what is happening in Iran. And I think that's quite important. I mean, I started my talk by saying that we are global citizens. We need to be aware of what's happening in the world around us. We need to stay on top of these things. I would say that it's a pretty lazy response to just say, oh, well, it didn't show up on my social media and therefore I don't know what's happening, or I have no idea what just happened in Turkey. So I think we need to go beyond that. And if your social media is not letting you know what just took place in a global context, make it, right? Follow actual channels and groups that will give you that, right? CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, the Middle East Eye, all these different entities actually have a channel, actually have sort of a platform. If you're on Twitter, the Twitter of Women Life Freedom is still a hashtag. If you're Shervin Hajipur, just became yet another hashtag. So you can definitely follow these to be able to stay aware of what is happening. Very much related to that, make sure that you share this news and this hashtag, right? Because again, you have the privilege of being at an academic institution. You have the expert knowledge at your fingertips. You could get that. Maybe others around you don't, right? Maybe your family members do not know what's happening in Iran and don't know what's at stake over there. So share to your circles, and so that you can affect those algorithms that actually make us be so bubbled and so siloed in the type of information that we're getting here and there. I think that the global attention to the protest has been really important. One of the tactics of the Islamic Republic of Iran has been to try to, I always use this analogy, is like to turn off the lights on Iran. That's why they're cracking down on social media. That's why they're cracking down on internet, because they're like, we don't want you to see what's going on here. We don't want you to see the protest of women having a bonfire
and under our headscarves, and we don't want you to see us cracking down on them, right? And the people are actually risking their lives and risking their freedoms to go ahead and push for a lot of these issues, right? So I think this is where that is extremely important and extremely significant. When you have the song Baroye be broadcast, obviously that artist knew what's at stake, right? Like, he put it out there from the tweets that people put of why they're protesting, and you heard some of those, for environmental reasons, for discriminatory reasons, for poverty, for class issues, for extinction of animals, right? So you saw all those reasons, and within hours he was arrested, right? And currently he's under house arrest. So people are risking their lives and their freedoms to get this news out for a global audience. So obviously we need to do this. And obviously it's an extremely political move to have the First Lady sort of give this award at the Grammys, which is another reason why we see this global, this is the video by the way of Dr. Jill Biden mentioning it, and she actually says that this is the first time that we've had. She called the award, or the award by the Grammys is called Best Song for Social Change, and this is the first ever category. And interestingly enough, talking about capitalism and neoliberalism, the song could not have competed in any other category because it was not released commercially. It was released via social media from protesters coming out. So they actually created this category, made a body to be able to sort of decide on it, and he won. And here we are talking about it, right, 2 days after the event. And 5 months after the eruption of the protest. I think that's another thing for us to keep in mind, that everything started in September 2022. Here we are in February of 2023 talking about these. And the third way that you can sort of contribute and help and show your solidarity is to donate to organizations and human rights entities that are working to elevate women's rights and issues. So I know on social media, a lot of different groups like UN Women, like many others, have been quite active. My organization, which is where I serve as an executive board member, called Women Living Under Muslim Laws, we're doing extensive work on this as well. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit, transnational feminist solidarity network. And for instance, we are working on a draft bill of rights on women's rights with input from feminists within Iran. So as a transnational entity, we are actually well connected to Iranians. So we can actually move towards those structural institutional changes that we're talking about, to make sure that the slogan women, life, freedom is not just a slogan that's just put out there, that actually manifests into something. So basically capitalize on the potential that it has right now. And also we've been launching a lot of campaigns and issue statements to raise awareness about the women-led protests in Iran. Women Living Under Muslim Laws played a key role on helping Commission of Status of Women to recognize that Iran should not be a member. I have a panel on March 8th at the Commission of Status of Women on behalf of Walum to basically talk about these things. So I think a lot of this work is quite influential that we can continue and do.
Thank you.
So one question, just to get us started with this is, you mentioned that the Iranian protests are leaderless. Can you explain why this is the case and its impact?
Yes, so it's leaderless. This is actually an extremely interesting so I talked about the Iranian protest also being a liberatory movement, and I put it in conversation with other liberatory movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. And in fact, one of the things that they've learned from other movements abroad is that it's actually beneficial to be leaderless, because when you have one particular group or one particular identified political party, the regime can just take that one person out, and then things will die out. So in fact, when you hear artists and celebrities and sort of the key spokespersons of the protest, they actually refer to the Black Lives Matter movement as an inspiration. They're like, well, we learned that it's much harder to crack down on a sort of a liberatory movement when it's identified. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is also because of how intersectional it is and how democratic is trying to be at the moment, to really be able to give a platform and to be able to have different groups feel represented. So I feel like it's one part of its strengths Some in the West are expressing frustration. I remember there was this interview that I recently did with CBC Canada, and then the journalist said, well, no, but really, who is the leader? Like, no, really, who is the leader? And I was just like, why are we feeling so frustrated with not knowing who the leader is, recognizing that it's a process, there's different conversations, it's not going to result in overnight change, and these things, people need to feel that it's a safe space to come and give their demands, and you can only do so when you don't have sort of the figurehead type of ideology or group or party. So I think it's quite intentional. And that's another reason why the arrests and the executions, unfortunately, have not resulted in sort of stifling of much, because people are saying, there's in fact a really nice slogan where they're saying like, oh, I'm gonna go forward and do this. I know I'll get arrested, but I know there's 10 others behind me, right? And I know when that happens and there's 10 others behind me. So I think that also mentality to say that enough is enough, we're all in this together, we're all risking, but yeah, we can't, there's no need to have that particular leader. Obviously, the intellectuals are the ones who are doing the research and the dialogues and leading those, that particularly at academic institutions, that is quite natural, but that's hundreds of thousands of individuals that are doing this.
Okay.
Good question.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
So kind of along that same like thinking, so I'm thinking about like the Black Lives Matter movement. And so in your presentation, you mentioned how there isn't this mass movement on the streets. Could you explain why that is and how that's beneficial?
Yes, so we haven't seen like mass protests the way we saw, for instance, in 1979, 78, where you had at some point like a million people in the streets demanding the toppling of the monarchy. That has not happened at all. You've had a few thousands here and there at most, or maybe even a few hundred. And that's another intentional move on behalf of the protesters, because they know the extent of the crackdown that is possible by the regime, and they know that they'll just get beaten and harassed. And Iranians have, this is the country, unfortunately, that knows very well firsthand executions and arrests and mass executions, right? I mean, many people have had individuals and loved ones be taken out by the state, and that's just the cost that is just unwilling for many, particularly for many parents whose youth are really the engine of this. So a very intentional aspect of this is that we don't want to do the work that way of making ourselves presently known in the streets. We're going to make our work known in other ways, like the strikes, like the sit-ins, like the statements, like the social media campaigns, and so on and so forth. And I think that's where you see where the regime is trying to crack down on social media, but then you also have a population that's very tech savvy, and they figure out ways to still get this news out, right? And that's why it's our job to be able to broadcast it. So I think that's very intentional, where they're thinking that their energy is better spent doing something else. Arab Spring was different, right? Arab Spring is where that political presence, that bodily presence of squares was important. But in this case, many are not feeling that it is.
We have a question from Kinza, who says, thank you for a great talk. Any legal changes or propositions, calls that took place recently in Iran following actions by the women-led movement?
So that's a very good question, where the regime has felt threatened, and they've tried to come with what we call conciliatory statements, moves, like, for instance, the morality police, which is such a wrong name to give. The English translation of morality police I have a problem with, because it's as though the people who are getting harassed are immoral, but that's not the case. It's just basically that their attire is not according to this extremist sort of interpretation. But nonetheless, there was talks of maybe removing the morality police as a force. There was talk of maybe, changing some things with regards to the hijab laws or the veiling laws. None of those have been concrete, and in fact, it's where you see the regime is trying to figure out how to respond, and it's not able to respond in sort of a uniform way. As far as the population and the protesters are concerned, these conciliatory moves, like, let's say, removing the morality police, would not be enough. Their protests have moved beyond that to now ask for regime change. And so many, particularly the feminists, particularly the members of the women's rights movement, are saying, like, no, we want absolute equality, freedom, rule of law, that these little changes will not satisfy. So, yeah, and we have a bad name.
Thank you, Dr. Tajali. So to what extent do you think international condemnation would improve social rights in Iran, and what might this look like throughout different countries?
Yeah, so this is one of those moments where the international community has a sort of a fine line to follow. On the one hand, the regime is saying these are orchestrated by the West, these are not, Iranians, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, obviously this is a liberatory movement that needs a lot of support. So one of the things that I personally, and me and a few colleagues have been pushing for is smarter sanctions that is specifically targeting the leaders and not the population. Iran has been experiencing sanctions extensively, and sanctions, unfortunately, when you're dealing with autocratic regimes, when you put sanctions, a lot of times it ends up harming the people versus those who are in power. Like what just happened 2 days ago with the earthquake. I just read on the news that Syria has not been able to access the same amount of relief as Turkey has been because Bashar al-Assad is under sanctions. So these are things that like you hear from these like international communities, 2023, like how have you not yet figured out to give aid in a way where the regime and the leaders are not. So I think that's what I said, like something we need to learn about these protests is the weaknesses and strengths of the international community. There are things called smart sanctions that could happen where the wealth of a particular individual or group is frozen abroad and so on and so forth, or they're not able to travel, whereas aid and internet and other things are still given to that population. Yeah, and I think this is something that us as those who are feminist activists are really well positioned to be able to guide. We just hope that they listen.
There's sort of a similar question online. So Zuhair asks, what external organizations are influencing the protests in Iran? You mentioned earlier that the protests are not anti-Islam, yet some consider those protests as a Western movement that is related to Islam.
Yes, the protests are not anti-Islam, and I explained that really well by saying that you have many believing veiled women, particularly within Iran, who have been pushing for voluntary veiling. I think that's where, unfortunately, because one of the things that the protest has been, the symbolism of the protest has been the headscarf, it has sort of fallen into the New Orientalist or sort of discourse where, oh, it's the veil, oh, let's not, there's too much sensitivity around it, let's not talk about it. And I think that's just such a wrong way of us thinking about this. It is a pro-democracy, pro-equality, and I mean gender equality across genders, and it's asking for those substantial changes. The people, Iran is a Muslim society, and we've had numerous Muslim societies and countries that veiling is voluntary in. And in fact, you see people, want to express their faith in those ways. When it's forced on you, that's a different story, right? So I think that's really important to clarify in this regard.
And I think the first part of your question might have gotten a little lost, which is like what external organizations are supporting the movements or influencing the movements, maybe for better or for worse.
Oh yes, okay. External organizations, I'm not sure what that means. Yeah, so I explained how the most recent spark happened. It was the killing of Mahsa Amini. I'm not aware of any other external organizations or entities. Obviously, media, international media has played a major role in covering it, and you do have some media that puts their own spin on it for their own political interest. But I think at the end of the day, what we need to recognize is that what's happening by the Iranians and what they need by the Iranians, and of course the scientific survey that I showed, it shows that there's a good section of the population that wants this drastic change, and that we just need to study them and give them a platform.
I think you had a question over here. Are you still?
Also, I feel like you already kind of answered it. But my question was, like looking at how Joe Biden like gave the award, and also I remember these protests first started breaking out. Social media, I saw people saying like, "Oh, the U.S. like needs to go over there and like, get involved." And my question is like, what would the implications be if foreign governments, but particularly the United States government, were to get involved? Considering the history of American involvement in the US.
Yes, very good question. Yes, and in fact, so Joe Biden just announced this on Sunday night. So already you have some that are celebrating the move of giving this song a Grammy because it obviously brings global attention. Had the song not gone a Grammy, I'm not kidding you, some Americans would not have known what's happening in Iran, right? So in that regard, like, let's be real, it's good. We need to give credit where credit is due. Yes, to have a first lady give this award, that's to me, that's a pretty interesting political move. Obviously it gets interpreted in different ways within the Iranian context. The Iranian elites, who obviously were critical of the Grammys, also pointed out that First Lady Obama gave the Oscar to Argo, the movie in 2012, which was the movie made by Ben Affleck that was about the hostage crisis in Iran. So this is how you know that the two countries have historical animosity. It's important to keep that in mind. And they are talking about it, but at the same time, that global attention, Shervin Hajipur, the singer, tweeted, "We won," right after the announcement, right? So he's not dismissing it, right? He's saying, like, somebody's hearing us. And the song was made from popular tweets, right? And it shows how intersectional it is. It's talking about Afghan children and so on and so forth. So I think in that regard, it's important that it's heard. And also Iran is a pretty oral, like many other Middle Eastern cultures, it's a very oral culture where poetry and music very easily lends itself to becoming an anthem. And I think that's another political aspect that we need to keep in mind, that maybe not all liberatory movements have their own anthem, whereas in Iran, every single one that we've had has had an anthem. And so very quickly, it becomes sort of a campaigning strategy. So in that regard, I think it's also important to keep in mind where culturally, where this song is, and also the fact that like in New York, band like translates and it covers it. Of course, like that's also like the global local aspects of it is also really fascinating to me.
So I just want to thank you again for your teaching, Dr. Tajali. And you mentioned earlier the potential impact that Iran's proximity to Afghanistan might have on this movement. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit, and if the extremely conservative gender ideology laws in Afghanistan are helping or hindering the movement for either party in Iran, being the protesters or the regime.
Yeah, I can comment on that based on my hopes. As a feminist activist and as a scholar, I'm extremely concerned with, seeing the impact of fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, any religious fundamentalism, right? Whether it's Christian fundamentalism, whether it's Jewish fundamentalism, whether it's Islamic fundamentalism, that and particularly how gendered that is. And at the same time, I see the potential of solidarity and sisterhood and coming together and working on a lot of these issues and elevating each other's status. So yes, one of the things I was giving a talk earlier at another academic setting where they also had a global audience, and someone from Malaysia raised her hand and she said, and she was a little bit older than me, let's put it that way. And she said, when the 1979 revolution happened in Iran, it came as a wave and it went through the region, and us in Malaysia felt it. And she meant it was just such a powerful Islamic sort of uprising that it had, not only did it affect Iran, but it affected other neighboring countries and it reached all the way to Malaysia. And her point was, do you think this could reverse that? Do you think this protest in Iran could potentially reverse that? And I was like, I hope so, So I think it's important to keep in mind that when a popular movement happens, like the 79 protests were also popular, but they very quickly became, very Islamic and they had important regional global implications. A particular liberatory movement in this regard can have that potential. And I think the ground is laid in the extent that it could potentially lead that way, in the sense that this is now year 44 of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is not the first time we've seen women protesting. Other countries are protesting. So yes, my hope is that because of the geographical proximity between Iran and Afghanistan and the connections between women's groups within there, we do see some sort of, and in fact we have, so Women, Life, Freedom, which is actually a Kurdish slogan, is the first time it's being uttered in Iran, and it's now being uttered in Afghanistan. So we see how slogans can even move across borders and ethnicities.
All right, any other questions before we take that? All right, we got one up front. Try not to.
So my question is regarding about just next steps and what we would like to see. So I'm just curious, what are some of the structural changes that Iranian protesters would like to see outside of their ultimate goal of removing the regime? Like, what would be the next step? Or what is the next goal?
Okay, so this is where I'm going to get a bit academic and cite other scholars, other researchers, because this is where, as I said, like we have the privilege of being at an academic setting, and obviously, you know, we're not in the ground in Iran. We don't know the context, so we can't predict. And I'm not holding my magic 8 balls. I can't really predict the future. What I can say is that scholarship, there's a scholar, Asif Fayyad, is a sociologist, who has said that, you know, he studies revolutions and reforms and sort of civil society movements across the Muslim world, including Iran. And one of his concepts is something that he calls a revolution. Instead of a revolution, it's a revolution, where it's sort of a reform towards a revolution, or it's sort of a reform that is quite revolutionary, that the end result becomes so different that you don't even recognize it from its previous version. So this is where I'm thinking we will not see necessarily a revolution the way we saw in 1979. I don't think the population are after that. Reform for many has also been too gradual, too little movement, where many are also frustrated with the reform movement in Iran, which is also a very, very long history. So I feel that at this juncture, in response to your question of what is next, I think the conversations that need to be had are being had. The laying the groundwork that needs to be laid out is being laid out. The sort of things that need to be put in place are gradually being put in place. Well, whether they'll succeed or not, we don't know, but I feel that it is recognizing that change will not happen overnight. It will not be something like how it happened in 1979. What I hear from many inside Iran in particular, and those also outside who are like refugees, are saying that we would want change and reform to the extent that it is so substantial and so structural that that is no longer associated with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And then when you ask them like what specifically, they're like absolute gender equalism, you know, bodily autonomy, equal opportunities, equal resources. So I think, and these are very abstract, very complicated things that, like, for instance, like gender equality. Like, are we saying gender equality, gender equity? Like, what do we mean? Are we saying democracy in the sense of, like, what is democracy? Let's define what, do we mean American style democracy where you still have electoral college and gerrymandering? Or do we mean another type of democracy? You know, so I think like all of these concepts need to be taken apart. People need to be part of that conversation. People need to be involved in these discussions. And that's where the work, a lot of the work is happening. Obviously, there's people who are trying to throw a wrench in the process, like the Islamic Republic, and trying to hijack the discussions. But I think at this stage, I'm being partly hopeful to see some of these are taking place. What we need to do is to keep the light on them, to recognize them, to study them, to write about them, to basically give them a platform, right? No one is saying anybody needs to speak on their behalf, but people are saying like, oh, I'm going to follow, I'm going to pay attention as much as I can. Yeah.
One over here.
Good question.
We got her first, then.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tajali. Can
Thank
you
you.
explain to me what liberalism has to do with sort of the Grammys and like the awarding of that song, like neoliberalism?
Oh, neoliberalism. Oh, yes. What I meant was basically the how the song could not be considered because it was not a commercially released. This is what I just read this morning. So yeah, so I feel like so it was a political move on behalf of the Grammys and on behalf of the United States. But yeah, that's why I said like it's important to acknowledge the political move. At the same time, it's important to give credit where credit is due because now there's the song is more in the spotlight than it was before.
Yes, so it's I understand it's like kind of like a soft power move.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Are any of the reformist candidates from the 2009 presidential election playing a role in trying to facilitate discussions about where to go next?
Good question. There's been an intentional move to not give them the platform. But obviously they still have a large following. So from the 2009 leaders, we have Mir Hossein Mousavi, who's the presidential candidate that many believe had won the elections, and then the neoconservative Ahmadinejad was reelected for a second term. He just came out and he said, from house arrest, by the way, he's still in house arrest ever since 2009. He came out and he said, we need to now think about a new constitution. We need to make sure that the constitution is going to be one that is democratic and that is liberal and so on and so forth. The former president, Khatami, who was in power for 8 years, he came out and he said something along those lines, but still saying, no, but we can still figure out something from within the system. So obviously, Iranian population are not homogeneous in any shape or form. They're not a monolith. You have some that are very much pro-Islamic Republic. You have some that want the exact opposite. You have some that are looking for reform. I'm not seeing that so I mostly research the women members and women party women and high-ranking women from these movements. I have seen them to be largely silent so far. And the large high-ranking reformists, except from these two figures, have been largely silent. And to me, that's a move on their part to just let the protesters do what they're doing, because whatever they're doing is sort of working. They're pushing for their demands, but also they know that they have not been able to reach their goals, and the population knows that they haven't been able to reach them. I mean, the whole slogans of reform didn't, including even on gender and women's rights, it didn't lead to any substantial changes. So that's another reason why they're sort of taking the backseat. And also maybe they're just taking the backseat as sort of observatory to be able to see, to not be blamed for if anything that goes wrong. Yes, so I feel that when I'm saying that these concepts have to be taken apart, like democracy, gender equality, gender equity, another term that needs to be taken apart in the Iranian context is reform, where if I use the word reform in an Iranian audience, I get like an allergic reaction. It's like, what do you mean? We gave reform a chance. It didn't work. Like, why would we go down that road again? So I think it's important to recognize that some people are trying to figure things out, but as far as that political faction, they're largely silent because the youth is just doing a good job on their own, keeping the discussions and directing the discussions. And I think, and also the reformist movement, they weren't radical the way some of what I hear coming out of Iran is radical, right? Like, I feel like Shervin's song talking about environmentalism, talking about LGBTQ rights, things that you expect to hear in today's day and age. The reformist movement falls very much behind that, at least until their latest iteration, because they were trying to work from within a very, very constrained structure. Many are saying, just take us out of that structure and just give us something completely new.
So, Dr. Tajali, one of the things that we always ask people is, you're an author. We often ask, who is your work in conversation with? So either living or dead, who are the other thinkers or writers when you see your book on the shelf or your work, who do you imagine your book kind of being friends with, right? Or and sort of, can you tell us if we want to read more or know more, who should we be reading and looking to?
Yes, thank you, ER. And again, I wanted to thank Karis Books and More. It's so important for me to have these conversations, not only on Agnes Scott, but also at a bookstore, at a feminist bookstore, and one of the oldest feminist bookstores of the South. I think these are, there's a reason why I really wanted to work collaboratively with you, is because I do see us having these conversations, and these conversations are really important. Iranians are doing it on their own, right? They're reading up on the Black Lives Matter movement. They're getting inspiration from them, and vice versa, right? Moving back and forth. I think the global, local connections are absolutely important. So yes, in terms of my book and where I get inspiration from, there's a whole genre of post-colonial feminists and scholars that are quite inspirational for me. In my global feminisms class, we've been reading the work of Chandra Mohanty, we've been reading the work of Bell Hooks, so these are the scholars who I consider to be sort of the inspirators of my type of writing, to be able to, and that's the type of writing that I really want to foster in my students, writing that recognizes the significance of power and institutions and these are things that you don't concretely see, but they're there. And you know that they're there because you experience them, but it's so damn difficult to try to fight them. But yet, can you poke holes in them, throughout time? Yes, you can. How can you poke holes through them? Together, right? By having these conversations. Not a single person on their own, or not a single scholar, in my opinion, can do these on their own unless you have an army behind you and you're sort of in dialogue and in conversation with one another to be able to push for these important radical changes. And it does take time. It can feel really frustrating, but then we get energy from each other, right? I get energy just being in a room with you guys. I get energy when I'm in the classroom in front of you guys, and I hope you guys get energy from me. So, and also thanks to the internet, now we get to even connect with each other across borders. So next week, for instance, we're going to be hearing from my partner in Morocco, Kenza Oumlil, Dr. Oumlil, who's going to be talking about women artists in North America talking back against Orientalist discourse, against imperialism. So I think these conversations are really, really, really important. So thank you for opening up the space to have these conversations.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much to our moderator.
Thank you, Joe. This was fantastic.